At first, I thought it was just coincidence. Little things that didn't add up but seemed trivial in the grand scheme of life. My new apartment was perfect, located in a quiet neighborhood that promised solitude, something I had been craving after the hustle of city life. I was excited to finally have a space that was mine, a sanctuary of peace. But as the days passed, I began to feel a discomfort I couldn't shake. It was subtle at first, the way the shadows outside my window seemed to linger a bit too long. At night, when I would sit by the window to unwind after work, I noticed the street below me was quieter than it should be. Sometimes I'd glance down and see a figure standing at the corner of the street, their posture rigid, still, like they were waiting for something or someone. I convinced myself it was nothing, maybe just the odd way the streetlights cast shadows at night. But then it started happening more often, and the figure didn't disappear after a few minutes like I had expected. They just stood there, watching the apartment building. The same figure every night. One evening, I decided to leave my apartment after dinner. I couldn't focus on anything, not the book in my hand, not the sounds of the city. My mind kept drifting back to the figure below. I went outside, telling myself it was nothing, just a person out for a late walk. I walked down the stairs and into the quiet streets. It was nearly midnight, and the air had a chill to it, making me shiver as I moved quickly, eager to clear my head. When I reached the corner where the figure had stood, I stopped, scanning the empty street. The only sound was the distant hum of traffic from a few blocks away. There was no one in sight. But then I felt it, a chill that crawled down my spine, creeping over me like fingers brushing against my skin. I turned my head, and there he was, standing across the street. It was the same figure, now closer than ever. I couldn't make out his features from this distance, but his presence felt different. He was closer now, almost like he had been waiting for me to notice him. My heart started pounding in my chest. I wanted to move, to run, but I stood frozen. I turned and walked briskly back to my building. My thoughts were racing, each one faster than the last, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Maybe it was nothing. Maybe he was just a neighbor or someone else who lived in the area, but deep down I knew something was wrong. That night, I hardly slept. The sound of my own breathing was too loud in the quiet apartment, and I kept imagining the figure standing in the shadows watching me. Every creak of the building, every car that passed by made me jump. I had to do something. I had to figure out what was going on. The next day I decided to be more vigilant. I set up a small camera by the window, hoping to capture whatever it was that had been happening. I was determined to get to the bottom of it, even if I had to prove it was just my imagination. That evening I sat by the window waiting. The camera was recording, and I kept my eyes on the street below. For a while, nothing happened. I started to think maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I had just been too paranoid. But then, as the clock struck midnight, the figure appeared again. This time, he didn't just stand still. He moved, pacing back and forth in front of the building. His steps were slow, deliberate, as though he was contemplating something or someone. I watched in horror as he stopped directly beneath my window, his head tilted up, as if he was staring right at me. I quickly backed away from the window, my heart racing. I couldn't breathe. I looked at the footage on the camera, hoping it would give me some clarity. But when I played it back, the footage was completely blank. Not a single frame, just static. Panic surged through me. I needed to get out of that apartment. I had to leave. But when I grabbed my keys and rushed to the door, something stopped me. The feeling that I was being watched, that I wasn't alone, was overwhelming. I turned back to look at the window, but the street was empty. The figure was gone. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling. I spent the night in a daze, pacing back and forth in my apartment, checking the locks, ensuring everything was secure. but no matter what I did, I couldn't escape the sense of being followed. I felt like I was being hunted. In the days that followed, I tried to reach out to the building's management, but they were less than helpful. They said it's probably just someone walking by, and that it was nothing to worry about, but they didn't understand. They didn't feel the eyes on them when they turned their back to the street, didn't hear the faint echo of footsteps behind them when they walked alone. I decided to confront it head on. I gathered my courage and went out one night to find the figure once and for all. I stood on the street corner, my eyes scanning every shadow. After what felt like hours, I saw him again, standing at the far end of the street, almost hidden in the darkness. This time I walked straight toward him, determined to get answers. As I approached, the air grew thick with tension. When I was just a few feet away, he moved. He stepped back into the darkness, as if he had been waiting for me to approach, for me to take the first step. I stopped in my tracks, suddenly terrified. I didn't want to face him. I didn't want to know why he had been watching me all this time. But there was no turning back now. I had to know the truth. And then, as if the world itself had decided I had seen enough, the figure turned and disappeared into the shadows. I stood there for a long time, my mind racing. Who was he? Why had he been watching me? Since that night, the footsteps have stopped. I haven't seen him again, though I still check the street every night, just in case. But the unease lingers like a shadow that refuses to leave. Maybe one day I'll find out who he is and what he wanted. But for now, I just wait, hoping that whatever it was that had been watching me is finally gone. It started with the silence. At first, I thought it was just a natural part of living alone. The absence of voices, the lack of sound in the house, it was peaceful in a way, but also unnerving. I could hear the occasional creaks of the wooden floors as I moved through my apartment, but that was it. The outside world felt distant, muffled, as if I was isolated from everything. Then I began noticing the small things. The curtain that I knew I had pulled shut was slightly ajar. The chair in the kitchen, which I hadn't touched, was pushed back from the table. These were minor things, the kind of details that could easily be explained away. Perhaps I was forgetting my own actions or misremembering, but over time these small occurrences began adding up. One night I came home late from work, exhausted from the long day. I opened the door to my apartment, expecting the usual emptiness, but the atmosphere was different. There was a chill in the air, colder than usual. The hair on the back of my neck stood up. I walked through the hallway, flipping on the light. The living room was dark, but nothing appeared out of the ordinary. I moved toward the kitchen and froze. The chair was back in the same spot, but this time it faced the door. I had never left it there. I stood in the doorway for a long time, just staring at it. It was as though it was waiting for me to notice. Suddenly, the sensation of being watched hit me like a punch to the chest. The hairs on my arms prickled. I scanned the room quickly, my breath coming faster. There was nothing. But that didn't ease the feeling that something or someone was there. I quickly grabbed my phone, checking for any missed messages or calls. I was alone. The silence of the apartment pressed down on me again. I called a friend, but there was no answer. I left a quick voicemail and hung up, hoping to shake off the uneasy feeling. But that night I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the chair, the strange coldness in the air. I kept seeing flashes of a figure, standing just outside the window or at the end of the hallway. Each time I looked, there was nothing. But the fear grew. In the days that followed, I became hyper-aware of everything around me. I started locking the doors and windows at night, even though I had never done that before. It felt like an instinct, like something inside me was telling me that I needed to protect myself. But still, I couldn't shake the feeling of being followed. One afternoon, as I was coming home from the grocery store, I spotted a man standing across the street. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, and had a hood pulled over his head. He didn't seem out of place, but the way he stood, staring at my apartment building, made my stomach twist. It wasn't like he was admiring the view. It was as if he was waiting for something. I couldn't help but look back. My steps slowed as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The man's eyes were hidden beneath the shadow of his hood, but I felt his gaze on me like a weight pressing down on my chest. I rushed inside, locking the door behind me. My heart raced and the silence of the apartment felt suffocating. I couldn't understand why this was happening. Why was I being watched? That night, I decided to stay alert. I positioned myself by the window, waiting for the man to appear again. Hours passed, but he didn't show up. The street was empty, quiet. I told myself it was nothing, that I had overreacted, but I couldn't shake the unease. The next day, I took a different route home from work. I didn't want to risk running into the man again. I had to break the pattern, but as I turned the corner onto my street, I froze. There he was, standing in the exact same spot, staring up at my apartment. I didn't move, didn't breathe. I watched him for what felt like an eternity. The same stillness in his posture, the same eerie presence that made the hairs on my arms stand up. Then he turned and walked away, disappearing into the shadows of the alley. That was when I knew something wasn't right. I couldn't keep pretending it was just my imagination. I spent the next few days trying to gather my courage. I thought about calling the police, but I wasn't sure what I could tell them. I didn't have a name, didn't have a reason for why he was watching me. The more I thought about it, the less I wanted to admit that I was being stalked. But I couldn't deny the facts anymore. The coldness in the air, the chair facing the door, the man across the street, it wasn't just paranoia. Something was happening, and I was in the middle of it. I started to take extra precautions. I moved the furniture around, trying to make my apartment feel less predictable. I installed extra locks on the windows and doors, but none of it helped. The feeling of being followed only grew stronger. One evening, I decided to confront it. I stayed up late, watching out the window, waiting for him to appear. When he did, I was ready. I opened the door and stepped into the hallway. The apartment building was eerily quiet, but I could hear footsteps from above. I wasn't sure if they were mine or someone else's. I made my way down the staircase, stepping carefully. At the bottom, I peeked out through the door. The street was empty, but my heart still raced. I waited there, holding my breath. My body was tense, every muscle straining. I couldn't explain why, but I knew I had to face it, had to make sure it was real. That's when I saw him again. He was standing at the end of the block, hidden in the shadows. He didn't move when he saw me, just stood there, like he was waiting for something. I didn't approach him. I wasn't ready for that yet. Instead, I stepped back inside, closing the door with a trembling hand. I watched through the peephole as he remained there, unmoving. The next day he was gone. I never saw him again. I don't know where he went or why he stopped following me. But I still keep the locks on my doors. I still watch the shadows, always wondering if he's still out there, waiting for me to slip up. I don't know if I'll ever truly be free of that feeling, the sense that I'm being watched, that I'm not alone in my own home. But for now, I'm just grateful that I can still tell this story, that I'm still here, still alive to share it. It's hard to explain when something shifts from ordinary to unsettling, but I'll try. I first noticed it when I moved into my new apartment. I'd lived in the city long enough to know how noisy and busy everything could be, so it was a relief to find a quiet corner of town with an affordable place. The apartment was perfect, just the right size, decent natural light, and in a building that wasn't too old. Still, from the moment I moved in, I began to feel like I wasn't alone. At first, I chalked it up to the usual unease of moving into a new space. But over the following weeks, I began to notice things that didn't sit right with me. It started with strange, low sounds that I couldn't place. At night, there were faint noises in the hallway outside my apartment. Not the usual creaks of an old building or the hum of the elevator, but something else, footsteps, always too quiet, always just outside the door, as if someone was standing there listening. I tried to ignore it. The noise would stop after a few minutes, and I'd convince myself it was just my imagination. But then came the shadows. I would wake up in the middle of the night with the feeling that something was different. My heart would race, and I'd lie there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, unable to shake the feeling of being watched. There would be a shadow lingering near the corner of my room or by the door. No matter how many times I looked, it would always disappear the second I turned my head. I began locking the door at night, triple-checking the locks, and pulling the curtains shut, but I couldn't escape the feeling that someone or something was lurking just out of sight. Then one evening, the shadow made itself known. I had just finished dinner and was getting ready for bed when I saw it. I was standing in front of the bathroom mirror, brushing my teeth, when I saw the reflection. There, in the darkened hallway just beyond the bathroom door, was the figure of a man. He was tall, wearing a dark coat, but there was something off about him. His features were indistinct, as if his face was a blur, or maybe it was just that he was too still to be real. I dropped my toothbrush in shock, but when I turned to look, the hallway was empty. I rushed out into the hallway, heart pounding, but there was no one there. The building was silent again. I thought about calling the police, but what could I say? Could I have said I saw someone, but they weren't really there? No one would believe me. I couldn't even believe it myself. The following days were a blur of restless nights and anxious glances over my shoulder. Every time I left my apartment, I would check the hallway to see if he was still there, but I never saw him again. Instead, it was as if he'd left his mark on me. One evening, I returned home late, after an exhausting day at work. I wasn't thinking clearly, lost in my thoughts, when I stepped off the elevator and into the hallway. The air felt thick, almost oppressive, and the familiar sense of dread hit me hard. As I neared my apartment door, I felt a coldness creep over me. A whisper of something, someone watching. I fumbled with my keys, and that's when I saw it. The shadow. It wasn't a trick of the light or a figment of my imagination. This time the figure was standing right outside my apartment door. I could feel the presence of someone, though I couldn't see their face. My breath caught in my throat. I didn't know what to do. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether to run or confront the person. Finally, I summoned every ounce of courage I had and reached for the doorknob. As I touched it, the figure moved. Slowly, it turned its head toward me, and for the first time I saw its eyes. They were hollow, black pits. There was no light in them, no recognition, just an overwhelming darkness. I gasped, stumbling backward, my heart hammering in my chest. Without thinking, I pushed the door open and rushed inside, locking it behind me. I leaned against it, breathing heavily, my hands shaking. The rest of that night passed in a blur. I didn't sleep. Instead, I paced back and forth, checking the locks again and again. I even considered leaving the apartment, but I couldn't shake the feeling that if I did, he would follow me. The next morning, I went to the building management office and demanded to speak with someone. I needed answers. I couldn't keep living like this. The manager looked at me like I was crazy, but he agreed to check the building's security cameras. When he came back, his expression had changed. He didn't say much, but he handed me the footage. It was from the night I had seen the shadow outside my door. In the footage, there was no one there. But what I saw made my blood run cold. In the video, right after I walked into the building, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway. It wasn't clear at first, but then the person stepped into view. And it was me. The footage clearly showed me entering the building, but in the hallway, I was no longer alone. There was another figure just behind me, walking in the same direction. And when I turned to the camera, I could see that same emptiness in the stranger's eyes. The manager said he'd never seen anything like it, I left the building that day, but I couldn't escape the truth. Someone or something had been following me, and I wasn't sure how to stop it. The worst part is, I never truly left. Every so often, when I walk through a hallway or glance in a mirror, I can feel those eyes on me again. I don't know if it's the same person. I don't even know if it's real. But I do know this: it hasn't stopped. And every time I feel the coldness creeping up behind me, I wonder if I'll be able to outrun it. It started as a simple mistake, an innocent encounter that spiraled into something darker. I still don't know how it happened, but it changed my life in a way I can't undo. I was at a local coffee shop trying to catch up on some reading for work. It was late, the kind of late where the cafe is quieter and only a few scattered souls sit by the windows with their laptops open or buried in their thoughts. It was one of those peaceful evenings I looked forward to all week. The noise from the espresso machine, the soft hum of quiet conversations, and the clinking of coffee cups created a comforting ambience. I had barely settled into my seat when I noticed him. He was sitting a few tables away, in the corner by the window, his back to me. His appearance didn't raise any immediate red flags. He was an older man, unremarkable in every way. I remember thinking that he looked like someone who belonged to this neighborhood, maybe one of the regulars who came in to read his newspaper every morning. Nothing about him seemed unusual until he glanced up. For a split second, our eyes met across the room. It was the briefest of moments, but it felt like everything froze. His expression wasn't unfriendly, yet something in it made my skin crawl. He didn't look away like most people do after an accidental glance. He just held my gaze, and in that brief instant, I felt a chill, a sense of being trapped. I quickly broke eye contact, brushing it off as my imagination running wild. But I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still staring at me. As I tried to return to my work, I could feel his presence from the corner of my eye. I didn't want to look over, but I kept sensing him, his attention directed toward me. A few minutes later, I glanced up, and sure enough, he was still watching me. His gaze was unwavering, and now it felt almost predatory. I stood up quickly, the chair scraping across the floor, and I walked to the counter to get another coffee, hoping to distract myself. As I waited in line, I could feel him following me with his eyes. I tried to ignore it, but my heart raced, and I felt increasingly uneasy. When I returned to my table, I noticed that his seat was empty. For a moment, I thought maybe I had imagined the whole thing, but then I saw him again, standing by the entrance. He wasn't looking at me now, he was staring intently out the door, as if waiting for someone. I tried to shrug it off, but the unease lingered. I kept my head down, pretending to focus on my work, but I couldn't ignore the sensation that I wasn't alone. Every few minutes I'd glance up and he was still there, lingering in my peripheral vision. It wasn't until I left the cafe that things took a turn for the worse. As I stepped outside, I caught sight of him again. This time he was standing across the street, watching me. It wasn't the kind of glance that people give when they're passing by. This was deliberate, an intense stare, as if he had been waiting for me. I paused, unsure of what to do. I kept walking, my pace quickening, but I could still feel his eyes on me. My footsteps echoed through the empty streets, and I cursed myself for not taking a different route. When I reached my apartment building, I thought I was finally safe. But that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A tap on my window. It was soft at first, a delicate knock that I almost convinced myself was the wind. But then it came again, louder this time, followed by the faint sound of breathing. My heart stopped. I turned off all the lights and crept to the window, my body tense with fear. Slowly I pulled the curtain aside just enough to see outside. There in the darkness I saw him. His face was pressed against the glass, his eyes wide and unblinking. There was no mistaking it now. The man from the cafe had followed me home. I stumbled back from the window, panic rising in my chest. I checked the locks on the door and windows, triple-checked them to make sure everything was secure, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still out there, watching me. The next morning I went to work in a haze, unable to shake the terror of the previous night. I couldn't get the image of his face out of my mind, and every time I passed a window or caught a reflection, I half expected to see him standing behind me. That evening I came home late, exhausted and desperate for some peace. But as I walked up to my apartment door, my blood ran cold. There on the ground in front of my door was a piece of paper. I bent down to pick it up, and my hands trembled as I unfolded it. It was a note. I'm always watching. I wanted to scream, to call the police, but I didn't know what to say. There was no evidence, nothing concrete. It could have been anyone. But deep down I knew it was him. I moved out of the apartment a few days later, not telling anyone why. I couldn't explain it, and I couldn't risk it happening again. I tried to forget about him, to move on with my life, but every time I looked over my shoulder, I couldn't shake the feeling that he was still following me. Sometimes I'll catch a glimpse of a figure out of the corner of my eye, or I'll feel a coldness on the back of my neck, as if he's standing right behind me. I can never be sure, but I know one thing for certain: I haven't escaped him. And sometimes, when I'm alone, I still hear that tap on the window. There was something